since the title of this conference is Friendship. For those who don't know me, my name is Orysia Bila. I'm a philosopher. I always say I'm a teacher of philosophy. And Yaroslav says, don't you dare to say that. You should say philosopher. And, so I will be bold this time. Our guest today is Peter McCormick. And Peter is the author of many books, numerous books, but we had a special occasion for this meeting. It's 3 books that have been published, and one more book is on the way.
No, it has been submitted, but not yet approved.
Okay.
It takes time.
We will proceed in a way that we'll talk with Peter about his books and about his views, about his philosophy. It's your chance, Peter, now to share some of your thoughts that you wanted maybe also to add to these books, to give an introduction to them. Our discussion is built in a way that we have a limited time, unfortunately, so we will have time for questions and discussions. But first, maybe a few words about yourself. Peter is Canadian of origin, right? But lives today in Paris. And I always ask myself, can I tell about you that you are a personalist philosopher, or would you oppose that?
Well, I don't think I'm a personalist philosopher. I'm interested in what and who persons are. But to call someone a personalist philosopher usually identifies them with a tradition in 20th century French philosophy, and I'm not part of that tradition, although I was a personal friend and a kind of assistant to Gabriel Marcel many, many years ago, and I did my studies with Paul Ricoeur. Both of those men were very sympathetic to some of the main claims in personalism, but they themselves, certainly Paul Ricoeur would not identify himself that way, and I don't think I would identify myself that way either. That question you asked, though, in this most recent collection of papers, In His Own Arms, there's a little citation on the back which is about the question of who you are. If you want to identify me, Orysia, then you must ask me these questions. So you might be interested not in reading the books, but at least in reading the back of the books.
You taught in Ottawa, right?
That's right, yes. I was taught in Ottawa for many years, about 30 years.
And you are a member of a Royal Society? Royal Society of Canada. And a permanent member of the Institut International de Philosophie in Paris.
Yes, but that's for my sins. If you become a member of these associations, you have to think twice why you have been asked to be a member of these associations. And clearly the idea is that we hope that if we make McCormick a member, we can do something to change his trajectory, because we're a little worried about it.
Well, then we will, I think being a Canadian is the destiny of being in 2 worlds of English and French speaking philosophers, and that's a big challenge also, because English philosophy is about analytics, it's about empiricism, it's a long tradition of Hume and empiricism and Oxford, and then French philosophy is about what they call continental philosophy. And if you want to teach somebody, you say you are a continental philosopher. That means you can get a wide range of things. But your books are, this is about your books also. When I read, when you look very poetic titles. And still, it's a philosophy that has very clear analytical structure. You go through very serious, deep issues of justice and war and human rights and human dignity, emotions. How do you connect that, poetry and philosophy? Why do you choose topics like that? Why do you choose titles like that?
Well, perhaps you haven't seen the titles. The first collection, which Orysia herself had worked very hard on to format this collection with several colleagues of hers and to bring it into print, thanks to Vladko Tochinovsky, who had sponsored these works, and in the context of the Institute, the International Institute for Ethics and Current Issues, which is always mentioned in the beginning, these works came about, so to speak. The first title, and this is what Orysia is referring to, it's called Of Three Minds, Essays in Ethics, the Political, the Social, the Global. Of Three Minds is not obviously poetic, but it's clearly not exactly plain speaking. We say in English, do you think, Vladko, it would be a good idea to publish a fourth collection of essays? And Vladko might say, I'm of two minds about that. It would be good, but we have to find funding for it, you know. And I'm of two minds, we say in English. But here is something which is of three minds. Why of three minds? Well, it's a citation from the work of a prominent 20th century American poet, whom I happen to like very much, Wallace Stevens. And his little poem in which this line appears is called 12 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. And he says, I was of three minds, like a tree in which there are three blackbirds. So there's the first title. The second title is In the Moment of Your Passage. That's more poetic. Essays in Ethics, the Aesthetic, the Metaphysical, and the Interpretive. And the one that is just, well, appeared last year is In His Own Arms. That's a little bit, that forces you in a certain direction. It's called Events, Actions, and Persons. Now, I think your question there, Marissa, was, look, Peter, okay, there are some collections of essays, there's various items in here, but these are supposed to be philosophical essays, and the subtitles say that very clearly. So why do you put poetic main title? Why is the book not called, the current book, why is it not called Events, Actions, and Persons? Why is it called In His Own Arms? In His Own Arms? What is this? So I think you're calling for a certain explanation of an obvious puzzlement here. And I think you're putting your finger on something important here. I think what I would like to say about that is very little. It seems to me that much work in English language philosophy today, whether it draws on the history of philosophy or on current events or on traditions in England or traditions in France, particularly in Germany, whether it's inspired by Greek philosophy, whatever, much English language philosophy today is, I believe, inattentive to the extraordinary richness of figurative language, of metaphor, and of simile, of images. The result is a kind of exaggeration of plain speaking. And here an historical footnote. You see, in the 18th century, in the development of the English language, John Dryden, who was a poet but above all a playwright, Dryden introduced into English what is called the plain style. And the plain style eschewed, it left aside many of these figurative resources of language. And as philosophy developed, particularly in England, less so in the United States, what happened was that philosophers took over rather unwittingly this, the importance of plain speaking. Moreover, those interested in philosophy in the late 19th century and the early 20th century reacted against a certain Hegelianism, a certain type of expression in English of Hegelian patterns of thought. And part of that reaction was stimulated by Russell, of course, and Wittgenstein and G.E. Moore, who were interested in logic and philosophy of language. So that reinforced the primacy of the plain style. So today, unfortunately, I think, in some of the very rich works which continue to appear in English language, whether they're written by English people or by Indian people or whoever, continue to, let's say, emphasize the importance of plain speaking. And they do well. However, they overlook some of the resources, some of what summons us to think in the first place, of these poetic resources of language. Much of our interactions with each other are not matters of plain speaking. We talk with each other in a variety of different ways, particularly in broken sentences and imperfect constructions. And that is not reflected in the philosophical interests of most people working even in the philosophy of language today. Some people in philosophy of language, of course, write about metaphor, but they don't use metaphors to write about a metaphor, and they're right not to do that. But at a certain point, they have to be wary. So, Orysia, I'm sorry you got me started on that because I tend to feel strong. I'm not a poet, and that's a pity. But the new book of essays, which is under consideration, is called It Was the Spirit That We Sought. The Spirit That We Sought. That's also from a Wallace Stevens poem, a very beautiful poem called The Idea of Order at Key West. In the one time, the idea of order, very philosophical. At Key West, what is that? Don't you begin to tremble a little bit when you say Key West in your mind? You know, it's the place we always dreamed of going, you know. Some of us dreamed of going. So that book also uses the same technique. It uses a poetic, the spirit of, what is this, a religious? It's not a religious book, it's a philosophical book. What's the spirit? You say the spirit that we sought at a professional conference in philosophy, and people start leaving the room, you know, literally. I mean, it's just, there's not much room for that way of talking. Orysia, again, I'm counting on you to just to stop this, you know. What do you think about this response? Is that satisfactory, or do you want to...
I really, when I was working with your books, this was the first thing that I noticed about them, that although you are English-speaking philosopher, you think like a French-speaking philosopher. That's what really struck me. I mean, the metaphors are there working, and today I was looking for some connections between poetry and philosophy, and I found some explanation like this. Philosophy and poetry have the same subject matter. However, philosophy is taking things rationally, and poetry takes them dogmatically. And I just could not agree with that, because I thought that poetry cannot be dogmatic in that sense that poetry has a lot of what we call semiotic gaps. It gives a lot of space for thought for a reader. So for me, this was really, I find myself in this poetic undertone and your rich metaphors, a space for thinking. And I think you're doing this well, also engaging a lot of Greek mythology and Greek background. Now, in this last book of yours, which I already said to you earlier, I really enjoyed, and I really, if you have not yet chance to read that, please do so. I found there a brave connection of you trying to talk about relatedness of emotions and philosophy. Although we usually think that philosophy and emotions cannot be together, philosophy is very rational and emotions only distract us from thinking. Could you explain more about this?
Well, I'll try to say very briefly a word or two about that difficult topic. But first of all, Orysia, it's very nice of you to say some of the things you've said, and I really appreciate it, and I appreciate your own work. I don't know whether some of you know Orysia's work. She knows a great deal about French philosophy, particularly about Michel Foucault, on which she wrote her doctoral dissertation at the University of Kiev. That's right, the University of Kiev. And so when she talks about this kind of French dimension or this French and English thing, she's really talking from her own perspective, which is that of a Ukrainian philosopher looking at some materials from France, particularly in the current period. And of course, she has a feeling to that kind of thing. So that's one of the reasons why I really appreciate what you said. So thank you for those comments. I share with you that dissatisfaction you expressed with something else there that you read. Now, just a word about what had become up until maybe 15 or 20 years ago. Yes, about that time, at least in the English language philosophical world. Again, it's important to distinguish between Great Britain and the English language philosophical world. The English language philosophical world is strongly Australian, for example. It's strongly Scandinavian. It's strongly Netherlandish or from the Netherlands. So, it's not that English is a world language and French is not. It's just that there are many people doing philosophy in English, even though it's not their first language. Now, in Australia, it is their first language. In the Netherlands, it's not. Same thing in Scandinavia. So when I talk about the English language philosophical world, I'm not talking about Oxbridge philosophy, the philosophy done at Oxford and Cambridge only. I'm talking about this larger area. Now, in that context, up until about 15 or 20 years ago, there was call it a strong bias about the proper, let's call it, cognitive worth, what kind of a source of knowledge, if any, could emotional states really be. And I think the bias was that traditionally, starting from Plato really, but even perhaps before that, there has been the sense that the emotions lead to confusion. They don't lead to clarity. The emotions are the kinds of things that are very difficult to put into words. We know when we're angry, we find words to express our anger. But to say exactly what the emotion of fear is, or to say exactly what compassion is, this is very difficult to do. So there was an artificial distinction that had become, we might say, rooted in between emotion on the one side and reason on the other side. Philosophy allied itself with reason, so philosophy was deeply suspicious of emotion. Philosophers were deeply suspicious of emotion. And they acted out some of their suspicions. Philosophers are seen as cold fish. Ask some women philosophers, and they will confirm that for you, while at the same time saying, I'm a philosopher and I'm not a cold fish. I don't like being considered a cold fish, okay? I'm me, and this is the way what I think about it, and I think about this because I think it's important. Gradually, people began to realize that rational states and emotional states cannot be separated so definitively. Most mental states include not just rational elements, but also emotional elements and other elements as well. So the separation between the two leads to distortions. That, just roughly, is a starting point. Much more to be said, much has been said. There's some excellent work been done on this, but most of us today, even old people like me, we find a sense of consolation we find our deeper instincts, which we never talk about in public, somehow or other being satisfied by this recognition that yes, you can be a philosopher and still be emotional. I mean, it's very satisfying for some people who are completely out of control, like myself, most of the time. You know, I mean, deeply satisfying. I don't have to give up philosophy. I don't have to give up my emotions if I want to continue to do philosophical work. It's hard on my wife. She'd like to see me give up philosophy, but you know, I can be emotional about philosophy too. Okay, you keep asking me these hard questions. I want to go on and on, but you got to say, stop, Peter, stop.
Well, in your books, you write not just theoretical things. Many of these topics that you raise, issues that you raise, they relate to the current situation in Europe, in Ukraine. You also here you write about Crimea, about Donetsk. You mentioned in the previous books you mentioned Romanian kids. I think in this thing we talk about also there's many things are said about European immigrants. How you see a relation between ethics and the not just theoretical ethics, but ethics and the real life, and I mean philosophical ethics. Are we as philosophers owing anything to the world, or what is the role of the ethics here?
Well, Orysia, as usual, you have many questions there, and most of them need a careful response. I think the issue here is a very central one, and I'll get to it in just a minute, but let me say this in advance. It's very important to me as a philosopher, since some of your questions actually get back to personal issues. It's very important for me as a philosopher to say that on the basis of a relatively long life and a fair amount of experience with philosophy, I happen to be convinced that there's very little that one can, properly speaking, know. And I'm very deeply convinced that as a philosopher, when these kinds of issues come up, there's very little I can say that has much substance and value. So I want to make that explicit because I don't have strong views, particularly about important matters. I'm filled with hesitations and doubts, and I kind of grope along. As one of the poets whom I like says, you know, a piece of philosophy is a momentary stay against confusion. I'm confused most of the time, and the older I get, the more philosophy I do, the deeper I realize how little I know, and how little my opinions really should be taken seriously. So it's important that everyone recognize those very deep limitations of philosophical inquiry. And I'll come to that at the end of our discussion if I can. Now about practice and theory, yes, I think you point out rightly that there's a mixture of that in this work, and how do I see that? Well, let me generalize rashly in a rather storytelling mode. People do philosophy for a variety of different reasons, and when students in the past and even friends had said, well, Peter, the question is not why do you do philosophy? I mean, everybody makes mistakes. The question is, why do you continue to do philosophy? You know, once you've got vocational stability and you had tenure, so to speak, you're still doing it. You know, one would have thought you would have seen through the phoniness of philosophy by now and done something respectable. You know, you ought to, and not only that, you've aligned yourself with all these rich people. You see, you can only do philosophy if you're rich. How many philosophers do you know in Burkina Faso? Oh, very few. You know, I've met some people there, but philosophy is a privilege most of us cannot afford. I mean, I happen to be born into a situation where my parents didn't have any money, and I don't have any money, But the society was such that I could actually be paid for reading books and writing readable essays and all of that. That's enrichment. That is a very unusual thing. I think philosophy for me has always started, as John Dewey has pointed out, an American philosopher, when something in the ordinary give and take of everyday life goes wrong. When something goes wrong, for me, it provokes me to reflect on certain things. But as I say to my students and friends, other people react to these provocations of everyday life when we lose our footing, or we become uncertain about something, or we doubt ourselves. They react to it in very different ways. So why do I react to it in what traditionally might be called a philosophical fashion? Well, I used to say, to get my friends laughing a bit, it's because I have a genetic problem. It's basically genetic. That's why I continue to do philosophy, even though I don't think there's much to be learned from philosophy. And then they didn't like that, so it was at a too low a level of scientific sophistication, because all the students know much more science than I do. So I said, well, I have a twisted protein. It's because of the twisted protein that I do philosophy. It's not my fault. And just like Socrates, I think the state should take care of me. And the state does a pretty good job, and I'm grateful for, my handicap, what we do. I mean, I have to do what I have to do. But then I had to get serious because some of my students were feeling let down. So I think what the Anglo-Irish poet William Yeats said captured some of my feelings. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Well, the madness of life, particularly the deep pathos of things, hurt me into philosophy. I do philosophy because I feel overwhelmed often by the extent of my confusions, the inadequacy of my efforts to try to be at the disposal of other people, my failures to really return affection, my self-centeredness, the self-affirmation of so much philosophical writing, the assertiveness of it all. That's why I suppose that's why I try to start with these practicalities. And the practicalities that afflict me are the same ones that afflict you. They're all around us. And when I start thinking about them, then that drives me into the theoretical. But why pursue the theoretical? This is what I think I owe to Dewey. You don't start with the theoretical. You start with the give and take of everyday life, where things are not quite what they should be, or what you think they should be. That kind of pushes you into a certain type of reflection. But then that reflection must not preoccupy you. You must take the fruits of that reflection and continually play it back into the practical. So there's this give and take between what gets you thinking, what are these interim results of your thinking, you try it out, that works well, something else has gone wrong, and then that throws you into the theoretical again. So I see it as a continually moving dynamic between the immersion in everyday life with all of its joys and all of its sorrows and sadnesses, and this attempt to kind of, make some sense of it. I know that's not very satisfactory, Orysia. I think you could pin my ears back for me if you go after it.
Let me ask you another question.
Sure.
What's wrong with the human dignity? I mean, when you talk about European immigrants, we talk a lot about this importance of human life and personal dignity, especially in the context of Europe and new immigrants. So what's wrong about this? What is that there that moves you, that you want to point out?
Let me try this out on you and see whether you'll be satisfied or you're going to hit me with another hard question. In my idiosyncratic way, because most of us, when you really push us and when we reflect, we become very idiosyncratic and we become very particular. and we come to recognize that there are so many different ways of looking at these things. I'm confronted by my own poverty, my own dispossession, my own fallibility, my own confusions, when I am forced to think about the immigrants. The immigrants, for me, the face of the immigrant is my own face. It's one I hide from myself. The deepest part of me is really my contingency. I don't have to be what I am. And this, not fallibility, but this contingency, there's nothing necessary about my being here now and my continuing to be here. That I find a revelation or a reflection of a profound dignity which is centered on something which I don't want to admit, which is my own impoverishment. Their plight is an externalization for me of my metaphysical situation. I am so deeply impoverished because I am a contingent reality. And that, or you could put it in, say, religious terms, I'm a creature. I'm not independent. I'm not autonomous. I want to be independent. I want to be autonomous. I want to be my own boss. But in fact, I'm not. First of all, I'm embodied. So that means that I had to deal with my awful hair. Today's a bad hair day, or, we have to deal with sickness. We have to deal with entropy. All of these things, it seems to me, touch on this question of contingency. So for me, I'm hopeless in the case of the immigrants. When I was a young man, I tried another tack. My tack was, as you pointed out to me today, that one of the people here is very much of a social activist. For a while, I was a social activist. Can you imagine plump Peter out there, kind of trying to help out the people at the port of Montreal, the down and out, as we say in English, the alcoholics, the schizophrenics, the homeless, those people. It was pretty bad, and I was in the thick of it. That's why I quote Daniel Berrigan at the end, because he took me to Harlem and said, now Peter, I want you to go around and do a census of what are the social needs of these people. All these black people from Haiti and so forth living in misery, until I did what I could, until I almost died because a big man had fit and strangled me. So I had to draw on my Boy Scout experience and break the stranglehold and hug him and get across the street, safely. The activist life for me, I'm not suited for it, but that's where my heart is. So all I can say then about that is that, speaking personally, whatever thought may have a value is for me something that must be plugged into the everyday nitty-gritty, the world of need and the world of want. It has to tie into that, no matter how abstract. Otherwise, it's abstraction for its own sake. And I see what that does to people. I see what it does to me. And I know many philosophers who are much smarter than I am. And yet I flatter myself by saying many philosophers are blind. They're blinded by their own intelligence. It's a paradoxical situation. They're so smart they don't know what they're doing. And it's a tragic situation. I think the only thing that keeps a philosopher doing that, woman or man or woman, is the inexhaustible richness of everyday life. The kind of thing you see in the paintings of Pierre Bonnat, just this sunlit room and an open window and a color here and there, nothing really important happening, and yet everything just throbbing and humming with life, which in the end is seen in those colors as an unaccountable gift that's there. It didn't have to be there, but it's there. And it's right there in front of you. It's there at the coffee break with those wonderful pastries. I had two. It's shocking. So, that's the kind of thing I see as getting me going in philosophy.
In one of your essays, write that without metaphysical understanding of persons, the basic ethical responsibility of collective entities like EU toward refugees or persons and other persons cannot be properly justified.
Okay, you better read that to me again. It sounds like an awful sentence.
Yes.
And we should revise that.
Sorry.
These are not books to be read, but very nice covers. Very nice covers. Thanks to the people here. And something on the back, The most you want to do with this book is look at the cover and read the back page, okay? The first half of the second half is in your book. The first half is picked out just for you, okay?
I mean,
yes.
You say, when you talk about ethical values toward immigrants, it's page 93, you say, for without a rationally satisfactory, non-naturalistic metaphysical understanding of persons, I do not think that the basic ethical responsibility of collective entities like the EU towards refugees and persons can be properly justified.
Mm-hmm.
You are saying that we should step away from naturalistic understanding of persons and then to find new metaphysical understanding of persons,
yes.
Or return. But are we in the trouble here? I mean, for many centuries we lived in a Christian world where metaphysics were clearly driven from Christ's message, from the whole Christian anthropology. Now we are in a world that calls itself post-secular, but I'm not sure this is
the right
back to metaphysics world or something. We're still in the search of new metaphysics. Is there ground for that?
Well, this of course is a little more abstracted question, so I'll be briefer. The harder the question, the shorter the response. I think at least in the intellectual world in which I've been forced to live, but I'm partly responsible for that, the reigning ideology, we might say, is what we might call a scientific naturalism. It's, in that sense, Aristotle is the patron saint of that. Aristotle was a biologist and had a naturalistic view of the world. And of course, he was a philosophical genius, and his work continues to animate a lot of that scientific naturalism. That is to say that everything can be ultimately explained in terms of, say, the physical laws that govern the universe. But of course, this kind of naturalism is sophisticated. That's the thing that we have to be careful about. It's not just that. There are many scientific naturalists, for example, who will admit to, say, non-material aspects of reality, who will concede that not everything in the natural world can be reduced to, say, law-like structures. And in that, they're just kind of believing what they see. They're good naturalists. They see that the complexity of the physical world itself, take the way uranium emits radiation. It's a very strange phenomenon. It looks like an immaterial substance, coming out of a material substance. Many scientists then, thoughtful scientists, many philosophers of science, have a very sophisticated type of scientific naturalism. And that's why many philosophers, well, no longer today, but some 15, 20 years ago, were always kind of struggling with straw men. They had this idea that every good scientist who's a naturalist is an atheist, kind of excludes all. No, this is silly. That it doesn't do justice to the reality. There is a mentality there. Now, I want to claim that one of the things that so far has resisted satisfactory scientific naturalistic explanation is the very complex phenomena of the person, or persons in the plural. And it seems to me that what is called for is a new metaphysical attempt to articulate what is at issue in the phenomena of persons that is not exclusively scientifically naturalistic. The idea is you don't reject scientific naturalism, but you have to say, in addition to scientific naturalism, we have to exploit some other phenomenon here, other aspects of the problem itself. Put it this way. If something genuinely puzzles you, as my non-necessary status, my contingency, that puzzles me. The way you start with the naturalistic world. You start with the everyday. You start with science, and you take it as far as you possibly can. By science, I also include here mathematics. You take it as far as you can. What you try to do is you try to solve philosophical problems, and historically, this is what happens in the early modern period, by subtracting from philosophy as many points at issue as you can hand over to the sciences for resolution. Here's a problem. We first try to solve it scientifically. It's only when you fail scientifically, after repeated attempts in community, the scientific community, it's only then that you can really authorize yourself to explore a non-exclusively naturalistic type of metaphysics. That's the direction I'm moving in. And I think there are phenomena, most people would agree, in not just personal life, but in our interpersonal lives, which cannot be satisfactorily resolved so far, because clever naturalistic philosophers say, well, we can't explain this now, but in principle, it's explainable. That's a kind of claim that's very difficult to sustain. Look, if you can't explain it now, maybe you might explain it in the future because the science is wrong. But for the meantime, that means you're open to a non-exclusively scientific type of naturalism. That's the direction I want to see further reflection, some further reflection, at least my own reflection on what it means, what's at stake in my being a person. And it's there, I think there is I get excited about that, and that's what I'm talking about there. And in this monograph, which I've just completed and which is being evaluated not by my friend Vlodko, it's being evaluated by another press, that book is on, that is a work in metaphysics, because the metaphysics only comes in the last two chapters. The first chapter is about disagreements between paleontologists and archaeologists on what's the difference between human beings and persons. And then the second part is about the language of, say, not the early Neanderthals, but the middle Neanderthals. There seems to be a breakthrough in certain natural capacities. For example, the use of symbolic discourse. That a whole central section that is exploration of other kinds of sciences, particularly linguistics. And then it's only after those efforts are made that my dissatisfactions then propel me, so to speak, into metaphysical reflections. Okay, but Peter, how do you make sense of the question, the nature of person? What kind of a question is that? And let's not talk about the nature of persons. Let's not talk about essences, although I personally do want to talk about essences, as some other philosophers do as well. They were out of fashion for quite a long time, but they're back in fashion, at least in analytic metaphysics. Let's talk about the ground of persons. What is it that grounds persons? Is that the same thing as causes them? No, it's not. Persons seem to have more than just causes. They have grounds. But what is the nature of these grounds of persons? You know, so that's an example then of how one is driven to, at least I feel driven to, trying to elaborate a non-exclusively scientific, naturalistic account of persons. You see, it was meant to be. This is going to end just let it pass, right? That's great. I love it when the bells ring. Saved by the bell, as we say in English. Shall we bring it to a conclusion?
Not yet.
She's really very difficult, you know. I like her very much, and I think she really keeps pushing me to the wall. This is what philosophers do.
I mean, that has to be.
Maybe we can close the windows so it's not
Well,
or we're not allowed.
it reminds us of other things. It certainly does. You know, one of the things I was going to say well, I'll save it for the conclusion. I know Liz is not going to let us get to your questions, and we won't have time for many because we've run down the clock. You know, it's like I learned this from the Prime Minister in England. There's a way of running down the clock. You know, it's not Brexit we're running down this session, the clock on this session. Shall I close the window?
I'll just give it a try, maybe.
Good, thank you.
I mean, Google, it's very.
That's a little better.
Yeah, it's much better. Thank you.
When you will be tired, just then yellow.
Yes, Orysia, if you want to.
One more question. I found that very interesting. You talk here a lot about justice, but you also, when you talk about justice, you mention something as oneness and two-ness. And oneness and two-ness have to be, it's hard to understand what is that, but that's from one and two. Oneness and two-ness.
It's pretty bad, this book, believe me.
No, it's interesting. Every title like a puzzle. So you have to get in that text to understand what is it about. And I think one of the it's actually about what the metaphysics of person. That
Yes.
You mentioned there a Japanese philosopher, but I think
That's true.
but I think it's not only about. I think for Eastern Europeans, specifically for Byzantine tradition, for Eastern Christians, that's also quite understandable concept of this. Two-ness is about the person is never fully a person on itself. Is that we become a fully human being only in relation to each other. And here, what comes in my mind, the story about Adam and Eve. Adam is actually a non-defined human being, and he becomes Ish as a man in Hebrew, only when Isha is made. Then they become two, and then you can kind of have a definition of a man and a woman. And before that, it's just Adam, like Adama is earth, and Adam is something that comes from earth, but he's the one. And so this biblical myth is returning always us to that concept that we are never a human being on our own. We kind of fulfill ourselves as human being in that relation to each other, in relation to the other. Can you tell more about this?
Briefly, yes. First, an anecdote. I had the immense good fortune when I was a younger man to be invited to a small conference in Japan. The conference consisted of about 15 or 16 philosophers, and it was very interestingly composed. About 5 of us were, say, of European background, that's to say North America, Europe, different countries in Europe, and the rest were Japanese, with the exception of 2 Korean philosophers. And there was a split in terms of ages as well. There were senior philosophers who were older, and there were people in their early 40s like myself at that time. And there were lots of very interesting things about this conference. It was the finest set of conferences I've ever really experienced. Well, this invitation was spread across 24 years. Very quickly, at the second year, the organizer of this conference, who had benefited from the gift of extraordinary resources, decided on what he called a core group of 5 people. And in the core group, there were 2 Europeans and 3 non-Europeans. And for God knows what reasons, I was a member of that core group. The result was that I went to Japan every year for 24 years. And each time, it was a question of from 10 days to 2 weeks in these very intensive discussions where all of my own presuppositions were put into question just by the cultural situation. For example, for a Japanese philosopher, when he's had his second and last glass of wine before he gets sick, Japanese people lack an enzyme for really dealing with alcohol, so they have difficulty having more than 1 glass of wine. But after the second glass of wine, people would get excited, and these Japanese colleagues would say, you know, Peter, you have many defects, but one of them is that you think there are philosophical problems in the plural, but there's only one philosophical problem. I said, I heard that before. I heard it from Karol Kozik in Prague. He said, the only philosophical problem is what could count as doing philosophy in times like these. I've never forgotten that. And I think Karol Kozik, in some ways, had a lot of things right there. Japanese said, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the cultural presuppositions you are ignorant of in doing philosophy. You see, from my Japanese perspective, there is only one philosophical issue. It's not a problem. It's not even a question. The issue is suffering. That is there. And that is part of the cultural presupposition of being a member of a Buddhist country. You lack that. You have other. You're very big on logos, Peter. You're really big on rationality. But that's a cultural presupposition. Well, we didn't get to the 4th or 5th glass of wine. It would be impolite. Now, that experience meant that in the course of those very fruitful years of my life, I came into contact, we always had invited guests, and we had the core group, with somewhere between 250 and 300 contemporary Japanese philosophers, perhaps about 20 or 25 contemporary Korean philosophers, no Chinese philosophers. Very interesting. And in that course of that time, I wound up having 4 life friends, 3 of whom are still with me, 1 of whom has passed away. And when you become friends in that context, then life opens out and your life changes. My life changed when I began to think about some of the things they kept saying. They said, look, Peter, you've got to get it straight. A person is not an individual. Do you hear that? A person is a matter of betweenness, aidagara. A person exists in this middle space between 2 other beings. A person is a betweenness. That's the way we say it in Japanese. And it's in our grammar. Okay. We don't like the I. No. It's the we. We know that leads to terrible things. This betweenness, interrelationality, interrelatedness, that's the move I made, but in English, not in Japanese. I don't know any Japanese, although I have Japanese friends. In my next life, I'll not only learn Ukrainian and Polish, but I will also learn Japanese. I'll be perfect. In any case, in that culture, thanks to that culture, I saw the promise of a not exclusively scientific naturalism. I said, the idea of the person is really the idea of a betweenness. And then I found in all things, in one of the medieval philosophers, a crazy character. He actually had a reflection, a metaphysical reflection on a certain type of relation. And this relation had to do with the simultaneity of the 2 terms at the same time in the relationship. That's the betweenness. So that's the direction I'm moving in. I don't use the Japanese expression. Maybe I cite the Japanese expression. It goes back to one of the greatest of contemporary Japanese philosophers. For a while, I edited a series in modern contemporary Japanese philosophy because of all these people that I met. I read their work to get read, but then I backed out of that because I'm not a specialist in that area. The only reason why this press had asked me to edit the thing was because I was not a specialist. All the specialists in modern Japanese philosophy, many of them hate each other. But since I was outside that nexus of jealousies, I was kind of a neutral figure. Well, McCormick doesn't know anything, and he knows he doesn't know anything, so let him do it. So that worked out for everyone's advantage. It was a good thing. So I'm digressing again, Orysia, but that's the background there, and that's an example of a non-exclusively scientific naturalism. It's the betweenness, I think, which is one, but not only, of the not just essential characteristics of the person, but one of the grounding characteristics of the person, okay? That is a metaphysical issue, and it's one which I'm hoping to develop further in not just plain talk, but plain and figurative talk. Poetry points to these things, you see, and philosophers really struggle to grasp what the poet is pointing at, because the language is fragmented, just like the will is weak and the mind is dark, language is broken. And part of the genius of poetry is to take these fragments, these tesserae, and work them into some kind of shape. That's what Pao Celan does. And you see that. And philosophers somehow or other don't see it often enough. They don't take it seriously enough. They think it's for those artistic people, the arty people. We're thinkers, but they're self-indulgent. I think Cheslov would like to say something.
Just on that point, it seems to me that, we all know that very famous book, classic of sociology, Chrysanthemum and the Sword by
Yes.
Benedict. And she refers to exactly that problem of that in-betweenness.
She does. I didn't realize that. I read that book too many
So you
years ago.
have to read that because it's extremely important. She underlines, and it was a report written for the American government on the Japanese society during the Second World War.
Yes.
And that was the recipe how to handle the Japanese after the end of the war. And one of these chapters covers exactly that point. That is to say, in Japanese you don't have just one single pronoun for me, for I.
That's right.
It depends on the context, it depends on the relationship. I can refer to me by one pronoun, but if I'm related to another person in a different way, I do not refer to myself by Y, but by I or me, but I have another pronoun. So you are not just I, you are many different things depending on how
right.
you are related to that person.
I'll
And
go
this
back to that.
actually, that metaphysical problems is, so to speak, discovered by the Japanese language, not by
Yes,
the Japanese philosophers, but by that linguistic practice of the Japanese.
You see how humiliating it is to have good friends. Cheslov is saying to me, Peter, there's nothing you know under the sun, right? You thought you had an idea, Peter, but she had it first, right? So give her credit.
Probably it's a different point, but quite interesting.
It's great,
She
Jeff.
wasn't
Thank
a
you
philosopher,
for that.
but very good sociologist.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book. That book is still very valuable, and
Yeah.
some Japanese colleagues, they still refer to that book among other books like that. Orysia, what do we do?
Since a person is betweenness, so there are
Good.
also other people here who really want to engage in a dialogue. So we should let them in, right? Maybe it's-
Right.
Yes.
Maybe what's next? I'd like to return back to the previous question about natural sciences, and the very nature of natural science is to be empirical sciences. And the overwhelming majority of the knowledge gathered by natural sciences is an a posteriori knowledge.
Yes.
And it is very logical when natural scientist says that for a moment we cannot explain some phenomena, some some things in this world. Maybe in future we will be equipped with new technologies, new techniques, and new approaches, I don't know, and we will be able to answer some questions. And it is logical, such answer, because it is fully in very methodological. But on the other hand, such an answer can be an answer in a sophist manner. Do not bother us with some questions which are not from our field. If we ask some natural scientist about metaphysical issues, they very often use to tell this kind of answer, which is not a pure answer. And if we come to very, very bold questions, for example, what blasted with this Big Bang theory? What was the origin of all this process? Well, they can still answer this question in some way. We don't know, maybe we will know. But if you try to ask them a metaphysical question, why did it blast? No, they tell you you are asking incorrect questions, claiming that your questions are not scientific in broad sense, not only from natural sciences. How to deal with this? Because the next question is how the consciousness appeared in this world. Consciousness which produced language, language laws, etc., interpersonal relations.
So is your question how to deal with that kind of
because
an
the
objection to
true
a
answer
non-conclusion?
Is very methodologically consistent.
I think
But
one
on
way
the
to
other
do
hand,
it
it is sufficient.
ask your scientist friend. First of all, you're fortunate to have a scientist friend. Most philosophers don't have friends among scientists and or among mathematicians either. And of course, friendship changes you, and it changes philosophers often for the better. Now, about the what to do with a person like that, I have no idea. You would have to decide for yourself. But I know what I would do in that situation. I would simply say to the scientist, the cosmologist, let's say, why do you think every question has to be put in the form of a problem?
Right.
Why is every question a problem? A question has an answer, or at least it has a response, but a problem has or it doesn't have a solution. That's a very big presupposition. So not every problematic situation can be properly characterized as being a problem. If you generalize, you say, what are the problems of philosophy? That's not the way to put it. What are the issues in philosophy? What are the questions in philosophy? Some of the questions do have a problematic nature, but not all of them do. And one of the obstacles I think you run into, say in free will and determinism issues, or mind-body problems, is you put exactly the relation between mind and body in the form of a problem. And then, if you cannot sketch the form of a possible solution, it's a pseudo-problem. And then it's to be dismissed. That's what a problem means to a scientist, is that we know what any solution to that particular issue, we know the form of any solution to that particular solution. We don't have the solution, but we know what form the solution should take. If we cannot specify the form of solution that that type of issue can take, then it's not a problem. It's something that, it's not my field. You know, I just excuse myself from thinking any further about it. That's a mistake. It's a presupposition that needs to be challenged in those types of discussions. At least, now, you know, there's much more to be said about that, and you especially could say much more about it. But that is just a quick response to that. I object to the idea that every philosophical issue is a problem. I don't think that's the case. And I think the result of taking that particular view is a real contraction, which really falsifies and distorts the reality, you know, that is summoning us to somehow or other come up with a response.
Just ask you, Peter, listening to you, I consider all these reflections rather challenging and also in some way convincing. Would it mean we have to rewrite at a certain moment in a very critical approach, say the modern or the history of modern philosophy? Because, I mean, critically speaking, you could also say, if you put it in a very general way, philosophy was taken by the scientific paradigm. And probably, I mean, even to be a little bit self-critical to our, say, as a philosopher, we could say, yeah, and we took it. We took that we were taken. And what we did, we were struggling, so to say, to save our place in the university and to be accepted. Yeah, in a way I overdo a little bit, but isn't this actually what you are doing and what you are gratefully doing with all your essays and so on and so on? Opening up the curtain again by trying to say, not interrupt the dialogue exactly with science in its naturalistic paradigm. So, I mean, you know what? Because if we look back a little bit, say to the ancient philosophers and so on, emotions, psychology, and so on and so on, this was, I mean, they did not give answers. Not everything was problematic. At least they pointed at it. And they took it as a serious issue to be reflected seriously within philosophy, and hence with philosophical terms. But we gave up to do that. I mean, it was even worse with theology. But you know, and social sciences, including psychology to a large extent, followed the same line. And therefore, all of a sudden, we discover that issues like conscience, like respect, like dignity, what you call the grounding, huh? I like this term very much. Huh? This all of a sudden disappears between our fingers, or we try again to describe it exactly in the way that you just were asking the question. Please give me the problem of it, and if you can't define the problem, then actually it's something we cannot talk about.
Well, I think that's a very generous and overly, let me say, charitable hearing of what I've overheard myself saying. I think I really don't have any such views or competence about the history of modern philosophy or the history of philosophy itself. What's important to state is that we must not shortchange the sciences, and particularly mathematics. We know that we're very deeply indebted to sciences, but it's because of that scientific orientation since the 17th century that philosophers themselves have very much come into the debt of the science. It's not that science has distorted philosophy. There have been many positive results of scientific inquiry for philosophical reflection. And I didn't say that. I was focusing on, yes, but there is this piece of course. And that's part of the distortion in this type of a discussion. Let me say this much. I have no program. I'm interested in certain issues. Most of these essays have been generated, not by me, they've been generated by Flutko and other people who kind enough to invite me to a conference and say, all right, Peter, the topic is fake news. The topic is post-truth. What do you think about that? Of course, I don't know anything about post-truth. Then he says, the topic is friendship after Facebook. What do you think about that? I don't think anything about that. Well, you're not coming unless you write something. These are what are called topical pieces. The topics are dictated by friends, colleagues who say, please, we'd like you to participate, and we know it's a bit of an imposition, but here's the theme. You've got to write about this. So most of the stuff I'm writing about, this is important to recognize, particularly about justice. These are not topics I've chosen. They've somehow or other been the themes which have been proposed by colleagues in conferences, to which I've been invited. And some of those have resulted in papers and so forth, and I've tried to put those out there. So if you say, well, Peter, do you have a program? I wish I did. It's true I'm interested in this kind of non-exclusively scientific, naturalistic metaphysics, and that's been exciting to me, but I wouldn't call it a program. I do have one thing I'd like to say, though, before we have to quit, and maybe someone else would like to say. Is there something someone else would like to say something here? I haven't responded to you appropriately there, Alois, but I owe you a good glass of wine anyway, so we'll get to it. Is there someone else who would like to say something at all? Just, you know, you can say whatever you want, and it doesn't have to be a question. It can be what we call in English an expostulation. It could be an insult. It could be whatever you want, you know. It could be just a twitch, you know. But if you want to make yourself heard, or if you want to try to get a point across, or if you like to especially get after Vlutko, who's responsible for all of this, you know, he set this thing up, I mean, you know, and who got dragooned into it, Orysia and myself, we're stuck where Vlutko's idea. This would be a good idea to have a session, really? Would anyone else like to say something before we rush for those remaining crumpets that are downstairs, those delicious things? No. What do you think? Orysia, can I?
Yes. Well,
you want to
you
say?
always write this for those young ones, right?
Those what?
For all those studying ethics and contemporary issues. Here is more, not any more young ones, but here I remember that because
Are you
I'm
talking about
editing them,
neighbors?
right? For younger scholars and students of ethics in Ukraine, but here and also in Eastern Europe. Can you share the final conclusions also? What are we really heading in ethics?
Okay.
What is the road there?
Okay, here's the road. Again, another story. Some years ago, Vlutko invited me to to participate in the extremely well-respected and very, very successful philosophy summer schools here at UCUM. And I had to decline the invitation. And then he asked me again, and I had to decline again. And then I said, well, I don't seem to be able to be free enough for those summer schools in philosophy, although I love teaching. I haven't done much teaching in the last 15 years or so. Maybe I can offer these essays. Well, what is the point of the essays? The point of the essays is to make available, mainly, to students and to younger academics, people who are at the instructor or assistant professor level, a series of affordable, cheap essays which are probably wrong-headed, which will probably stimulate them to disagree. The idea is to put those out on the table and say, look, this is kvatch, right? Now, why is it kvatch, you see? And they'll get thinking about it and saying, you know, McCormick is completely wrong about immigration. He's completely crazy about this issue of justice. And what he says about two-ness and oneness, I don't care whether he quotes Plato, it's simply wrong, okay? He didn't get it right. He gets nothing right in these essays. He just goes on and on endlessly, and, you know, here's the way to look at it. That's what I want to hear. That's what I want to hear. Because here in this post-Soviet society, in a time of terrific geopolitical risk, in a time where these problems are so great, problems of climate, immigration, you know, problems of the disappearance of species, all of these terrible things that are happening to us. You know, we live, as Bill McKinnon, one of these ecologists, writes, we live at a moment of loss. That's what we're living in now, a moment of loss. And what is called for in a moment of loss is many things. Not only patience with ourselves, but can we, as just a community of human beings spread across the earth, can we really succeed in saving the earth, saving ourselves? I don't know. Things don't look good. But if at least if I can put on the table something that might provoke people because of its wrong-headedness to think for themselves, that would be lovely. But certainly coming from outside Ukraine, not knowing the language, not knowing the history, having a completely different culture, having a Northwestern European mentality, you know, knowing a lot of ancient Greek, but never having assimilated, you know, a Byzantine way of looking at things. I don't have a sense of it. You know, my liturgy is not your liturgy, okay? And here I am coming in from outside, and I'm saying, you know, here's something for you people in Ukraine to think about. No. There's nothing in these books that, you know, put it this way, there's very little in these books, despite the nice words Orysia said, that you're going to agree with. If you don't disagree with it, then, you know, you're not working hard enough. You've got to sit there and say, this is not right for these reasons. And as soon as you do that, then you're in the conversation. You've got to get into the conversation with each other. This is my gesture towards Vlodko and the rest of you, the summer schools in philosophy. That's what I do. And that's how these things have originated. Now, what do I have to offer? I offer a spectacle in these books. This is a dramatization of how wrong-headed some well-meaning individuals can go. You read some of this stuff and you say, you know, in one of the essays I quote that about poverty. Poverty is a deeper issue to me than immigration. Remind yourself, Peter, every day, philosophy bakes no bread. You got that, Peter? Philosophy bakes no bread. Philosophy is poor. Philosophy is poor as a church mouse because reason is poor. Because, as I was saying, in that Augustinian spirit, let's not be Jansenists, but the mind is dark. The will is weak. Language is broken, okay? There's very little clarity we can bring into our lives and certainly into our actions. That's why philosophy is so poor. Philosophy it does so little. And people think it can do so much. Look at religion, look at art, look at history. These are so much richer pursuits than philosophy. It's not your fate, but it's mine, okay? And that means you've got a chance to go your own way. I've already gone too far. And what I've come up with is kind of disillusion. I wouldn't put it that way. But there is, as Orysia pointed out to me in a conversation, there is a note, a pervading tone of sadness in this work, which is a reflection of how little philosophy can do to help us somehow or other lead a decent life, put it that way. How little philosophical ethics can help us lead a decent life. Okay, this is poor stuff. And you can see it if you get into it. That's what I want to say about that issue. So let me just try to bring this to an end. If I can get around Orysia, she's very difficult to deal with. She keeps insisting on things. Orysia, let me just take this one thing from the back of In His Own Arms. There is an essay in this book, the collection that came out, on compassion. I don't like talking about compassion. I don't like talking about most of these things. They embarrass me. It's my Irish background, okay? I'm kind of shy, you might say. I like to hide. Compassion is a difficult matter for a philosopher. I want to say something like this. The experience of compassion does not seem to be satisfactorily understandable in scientifically naturalist ways only. See, that picks up on the thing. Rather, understanding compassion would seem to presuppose a causally open understanding, not causally closed, causally open understanding of some elements of experience as a whole, not as a part. For scientists, the world is causally closed. Okay, there are causes. The openness at issue here in partial view sometimes only in the very structures of fictional, human, and divine persons, seems to surpass the reach of philosophical ethics itself. That's the poverty thing. You know, philosophy is a poor man's thing. Perhaps this openness surpasses, too, any finally merely philosophical elucidations here in this book. That's stressing all the point, always the contingency, the fallibility, you know, the littleness of philosophy. If somebody's a philosopher, pray for her, pray for him, okay? For what seems to be at stake in talk of openness here, what is at stake in that? Is willingness to answer, are you willing, McCormick, to answer a fundamental and always recurring question? And here's where I quote this icon of my youth, my misplaced youth, my wasted youth. This icon was Thomas Merton, who was a Cistercian monk and quite a man about town before he got religion at the age of 27. He was a big man at Columbia and so forth, quite a character. He writes, if you want to identify me, this seems to be part of the openness I'm talking about. If you want to identify me, Merton's version of that fundamental question, what is openness, went. This was when he's trying to cross the border. He's trying to come from Poland into Ukraine with a French identity card. You need a French passport, you know. So trying to get across the border. And the border guard said, who are you? If you want to identify me, he says to the border guards, gets them all upset. If you want to identify me, Merton, ask me not what my name is or where I live. Ask me what I think I am living for. Ask me in detail. And secondly, ask me what I think is keeping me from living fully for the thing I want to live for. And before this session, I said to Orysia, if you ask me this question, you say, Peter, what do I think I'm living for? If you say, tell us in detail what you think you're living for, Peter. I won't answer the question because I don't think I can answer that question satisfactorily to myself. I have an idea I can, but I'm not sure I can. And suppose you went on to ask me then, or said, what do you think is keeping me, Peter, from living fully for the thing I want to live for? I think I could ask I could give you a shot. I'll tell you what's keeping me. Doing philosophy is keeping me. That's what's keeping me. So I'm ending this thing not on a pessimistic note, but I'm saying, watch out. Watch out for philosophy. If it gets to you, make sure your friends pray for you.